We are now ready to move on to the next slide because I think John McCarthy is now with us and he's able to walk us through the TTF cybersecurity guidance. John, are you there and can you take the virtual mic?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to listen to this, and thanks very much for inviting me to present on what I think is a really pertinent component of our world. It relates to cybersecurity and work that we undertook in order to capture a number of elements relating to this. I suppose a preface to the topic on cybersecurity, it might be slightly outside some of our direct kind of day-to-day activities. I think that will change sooner rather than later as technology is becoming more and more connected, as our lives are becoming more and more connected. A huge amount of data is going to be generated, is already generated, and the flip side is that is ensuring that it is safe and it is secure and that is trusted. And so what does that mean from a TTF perspective is the course of these next slides. Let me do the next one. Okay. So in terms of what I'll be talking about today is representing to you what actually is the cybersecurity signposting, where can it be found, and how you might navigate. And I think, you know, there are three simple areas, but it's important to understand, you know, you do a piece of work, you present it, that it doesn't go to waste, that it has a long-term value. And that's kind of what was impressed upon us by the TTF, that the work that we have to do, or that we did, you know, is going to be accessible to people, that they understand the context of it, and that they can use it. And I suppose that the challenge will be particularly in an area of cybersecurity, which relates to changing technology fields, keeping abreast of this and keeping it timely. But you have to start by starting. So the next slide. It's quite slow, just updating. There we go. So there's 4 elements considered from the cybersecurity perspective, and I suppose that's trying to capture the ecosystem that exists now within a digital domain. We're probably more familiar, and certainly over the years of involved in transport infrastructure projects, very familiar and concerned and focused on the physical infrastructure and getting that right. What's more apparent now is that the digital infrastructure is an asset in itself, and that has to be designed, that has to be delivered, and it has to be encapsulated within the remit of how is it safe. And the cybersecurity is going to be touching upon 4 main elements. One is around the cybersecurity for the roadside infrastructure, and I'll touch upon that in later slides. The kit that you put into the ground, how is that going to be safe and how is that going to be secure? The cybersecurity for the vehicles, I suppose. We're not going to be deciding the design criteria for the inside of the vehicle, but what we will be influencing and probably defining is the interface between the vehicle and the infrastructure, and that coalescing between the physical and the digital domain, which is going to be really important now. We talk about cooperative ITS, where intelligent transport systems are now talking to each other, talking to the vehicle. So the vehicle is now a component that has to be considered from a cybersecurity perspective, and has to be considered from the TTF's perspective because it's part of the ecosystem. It can have a negative attribute in terms of the safety of our system. Then the third element is around the general layers of cybersecurity, covering data protection, the data management systems, maybe not the most glamorous for some of us, but it is in the back end where a lot of this cybersecurity and safety issues will be addressed, and that has to be understood as well. What data protection requirements do you put in? What governance layers do you put in? What are the standards that drive that? The fourth element relates to the communications elements. Data is created. Unless it's transmitted somewhere, data is of no value really. So it has to be transmitted, and it's the transmission of it, it's the conversion of it to information, and then the display of that to drive intelligence. And all of that is a data chain. And behind the data chain, or cloaked around that, should be the cybersecurity elements to bring all of that together. And we see headlines, unfortunately every day where systems are hacked. And that's the world that we're kind of dipping our toes into, probably dipping our toes, and soon will be our ankles, and soon we'll be, swimming in it, because that's the way the market is going. And there's a need then to address our skill sets, our knowledge area, and how we can, function in terms of delivering our solutions to the wider world. So if I move on to the next slide, just wait for it to update. I suppose the infographic, actually, just on the infographic, there's a one-page note to explain all of this. So after the talk today, that there'll be a slide that you'll be able to take for yourselves and read it at your leisure to understand it. Now, I talked about roadside infrastructure, and we're familiar. All members of the TTF should be very familiar with putting kit on the street. Traditionally, you might be bringing that data back through a cable system. Now you might be bringing back to a wireless system. You might be sticking variable message signs on the side of the road. You have CCTV, you have automatic number plate recognition, Bluetooth detectors, Wi-Fi detectors. You have sniffers then associated with that, mobile phone data. So lots of infrastructure going out onto the street. And if we're planning the design and the deployment of a physical piece of infrastructure, what ducting is needing, what cable length is associated with that. We also have to consider the standards that will be required both in the procurement phase and the deployment phase for the deployment of physical infrastructure. And that's a key component. So when I talked about the 4 elements that are covered within this activity, the roadside infrastructure, particularly for members of the TTF, is a key component, because all of these kits on the side of the road now have to be associated with a standard, and standards are emerging, standards are changing. They have to be, always updated because of the technology that exists as it stands. So we have to be mindful of that. From a vehicle's perspective, as I said, it's not necessarily within the vehicle itself, because we aren't car manufacturers. Or our skill set is on the touch points around the vehicle here, where it talks to the other domains. And there's a lot of debate in the industry about the use of discrete short-range communications, the use of mobile phone communications in order for vehicles to talk to each other. So that's ITSG5 versus 5G in terms of the services that might be delivered. And services is a key point here, because within the cooperative ITS EU activities, which have driven a number of activities at a global level, we have day 1 and day 1.5 services. And at the core of all of those services is the ability to communicate with the travelling public, and have the travelling public being able to communicate back to ourselves within network authorities, within road authorities. So this interface is really important, and the standards now are becoming critical, because your touch point outside of your natural domain is potentially going to be your weakest point. Within an IT system, they say that a printer is your weakest element from a cybersecurity perspective, because it's something that people don't consider. And with printers becoming more smart, they can be hacked. Any connection out, any port that you open, any API that's available to the outside world, that's an opportunity for someone with a negative intent to try and access it. And if they access it, what damage can they do? They can change traffic lights. They can change information that's been sent out there. They can undermine trust, which I think is the fundamental here. Where we share information to the travelling public, we want them to trust that information. If they're not able to trust it because that information is hacked, that information is taken from them, or information from the vehicle, from the user, through a pathway is then hacked, then that is, opening up a whole bunch of questions in terms of, service levels agreement, the insurance, the legal requirements associated with the cooperative ITS. Then interfacing with the road users, the vehicle detection sensors, those sensors that are out there, and the migration from mobile phones. So at the start of this talk, I would hope that you would say, all right, TTF, very much focused on physical infrastructure elements, but now we have to consider the coalescing of that physical with the digital domain. Now, we see the ads out there. You're driving your Tesla, you're hailing your Tesla through your mobile phone from its parking slot. I don't drive a Tesla. It looks fantastic. The challenge associated with that is making sure that the physical infrastructure and the data that's being transmitted between where it sits, and that might require a digital map to be in place. And then are you responsible for the upkeep of that map? So lots of questions relating to the service level agreements, and then the impact of the cybersecurity on all of that. So the operational model now is becoming into consideration. I'm not raising this to try and frighten people, because what we've done here through this work is actually trying to capture the standards that would guide the elements associated with that. And that's, what we've done. We've posted the cybersecurity signposting guidance on a site within the TTF, so all members can look at that and they can see what it looks like. And I suppose a snapshot of what it looks like, when you go into this website, you'll be introduced to three elements here: the category, which are those four pieces that I talked about relating to the communications, the mobile phone or other elements, the general elements around data security, ITS, the physical infrastructure perspective, and the vehicles, that touch point. So those are the categories that you might want to consider. And then the subcategory is, you know, a level of detail beyond or beneath those major categories. And what we found from looking at the market and from, I suppose, from our own understanding of where that's going, it's divided up into a number of areas, but in particular, cryptography, which is at the essence of cybersecurity, data security, which is a layer probably that touches upon all of these elements, governance, risk and compliance, GRC, in terms of how you organize your data and ensure its security from a standards perspective, and then being able to link it into your policies. The operational elements, how you want to operate as a business or as an authority, and the security requirements that are then entrusted upon you, and then the protocols, getting down to the technical elements then. And I suppose then at the third, and then, you know, the third area here is around the type of documentation. And, you know, what we see, particularly the standards area within cybersecurity, because it is an emerging area, it is an area that's changing all the time. That's the challenge within this area, that you have directives, you have frameworks in place, you have guidance notes, you have online resources, and you have standards. So members of the TTF, if they want to consider what information, I suppose, needs to be considered for any physical asset that would need to go out there, they would click on ITS, they would go into the subcategory, and then they would see what information would be available. For example, I'm very much focused on ITS, the operations side of things. I go in, I look at what's available, and I see it's just standards. So I go into the standards note, and I show on the next slide is the information associated with that. I think, you know, what is apparent through the work that we've done is that there is an amount of information out there to guide the members within the TTF, within the online resources and the guidelines. They're not standards per se, but certainly they will be able to influence the information that you would include, say, in a procurement activity, or that you might include into an asset management piece going forward, or into your key performance indicators of how you're going to measure your digital infrastructure. So there's a lot of information out there, you know, and I appreciate some of this might be quite new, and this is a very quick run through, which was a very technical area. But the interface here in green allows you to navigate this in a way that has a bit of structure to it, so that you know which level you're at and how it relates to the four overall areas in terms of communications, the general area, ITS and vehicles. And when you go into it, up. How do I go back? Let me go back. Skipped ahead. Here we go. When you click on the standards piece, what will come up, and you know, it might look like a lot of information, but it's trying to categorize it. It's trying to say, where does it come from? This is a category of ITS operations in that column going down. The category all relates to ITS in this activity. We've chosen operations, so those all three should make sense. Then the next piece is the identifier. So if you're putting documentation together, you would say, all right, I would expect the supplier in the market to reference ISO. I think this is one for 827, 2006, 2005 as the resource to utilize. And what we've tried to do as well is to give an explanation of what this standard looks like, so that you're able to, we tried to do an elevator pitch piece also, so that, you know, you go in, you have a look at it, you understand whether it's relevant or not, and then you can scroll down, and, you know, this is just, I've shown 6 there. There's a lot more when you go into the website and you see how it relates, and there's a location given. So that you can go from the TTF website to another website to get more detail of that information also. And this is an example. So if I click on one of those links, and here I go, some of the standards are, you know, you need to purchase it. Some are available online, but it's explaining the abstract here. This particular one is on ITS and quite relevant to TTF, is around the communication links between your sensor to your field device, so that roadside modules communication. If we're taking roadside units out onto the street, whether it's for connected ITS, whether it's for connecting autonomous vehicles, the standard here should be associated with the cybersecurity that would need to be put in place. It also touches upon the DATEX standards in this particular one. So there's layers of information within the standards also. But I think, you know, at a very straightforward level, it's being able to go in. It is have a resource where you can identify where all of this information is found. So that's a very quick run through what the work was undertaken, and I'm open to questions if you want to pose them, or whatever works. Steve, I'll let you say what works best.
I'll ask you a question myself, but in the event Q&A, a question has come up, and it is there a widely accepted threat assessment? Because if people are trying to work out where the cybersecurity design begins, presumably, as you were saying before, people need to look at where the vulnerabilities are and what the threats are attaching to those. So do they sort of start with practically perhaps a diagram like you showed us, which helps you think through where does the vulnerability come? Where is the link to the printer in the system that I'm just about to go and buy?
Yeah, no, there are a number of resources out there. I suppose off the top of my head, ENISA have diagrammatically shown the ecosystem and then how they have ranked and categorized the different elements associated with that ecosystem. So that's a resource that's touched upon in this as well. But yeah, that does exist.
Okay, and the thing that does strike me, obviously this has been quite a quick canter through quite a complicated area, to be honest. There's a mix here of ISO standards that you might need to download, understand, or even buy. How well do you think our guidance is going to help people who not only are not terribly proficient in cybersecurity, but they might not be all that proficient in procurement either? And so they're going to need to be talking to their procurement colleagues, perhaps their contract drafting colleagues, on how to incorporate all of the right requirements and obligations. Do you think we're holding their hands tightly enough? Have we done any dry runs with this to see how novices engage with the system?
I suppose, you know, a very good question, and I'll just break it down into a number of parts. In terms of having, I suppose I look at this as a service that's been created for members of the TTF to access, and a lot of members, you know, quite naturally might not be comfortable or might not be overly au fait with cybersecurity, as it sits outside a domain expertise that they might have. What we have done successfully is to categorize all the different elements that exist within the ecosystem and break it down into very digestible parts, so these 4 parts. And then within those 4 parts, again, breaking it down into areas that are readily acceptable or accessible, I think is the key part here. The information on the Excel spreadsheet that shows up then will allow people to quickly assess whether the information is of relevance or not, because there's a lot of information that is out there on the marketplace, and having information that is of relevance is the most important. And I think then, having identified what is of relevance, you know, collaboration with procurement partners is important. I think throughout this domain, and I talk about this domain in a wider perspective linked into intelligent mobility and connected ITS, collaboration is going to be key, because the skill sets to ensure that the delivery of systems and modules are going to be touching upon a number of different domains. But at least this tool and service allows people to make informed, or to begin the conversation in an informed way. And it's about breaking it down into digestible elements.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And apologies that this again went past me quite quickly. When is this going to be up and running on our website?
It's up and running today. Excellent.
Okay, well there, if you're on the conference, you heard it here first. This guidance is up, it's there, it's available. The best time to be having a look at it, I would suggest, is before you actually really need to. So become familiar, start to get a sense of the obligations, the contractual obligations that you're going to need well in advance of trying to write a contract or going to market. So it's there to have a look at. And of course, as with all TTF products, I guess, John, we're very happy to get feedback on this, and we could revise and refine it in the light of people's experience.
Yeah, of course, that's really important and a very good point to make, Steve.